So today on Culture Architects, we're joined by Dr. Kent Wessinger. Kent's a researcher. He's the CEO and chief people scientist at Retention Partners. He's also the author of Bridges Over Ladders: Secure Growth and Fortify Revenue with Millennial Employees, Clients, and Members. Kent's proprietary research on the millennial generation tells us that the younger generations currently take up the largest share of the workforce. And yet, here's the really interesting thing. 3/4 of all organizations are absolutely ill-equipped, and we're going to talk about this a lot, to attract, engage, and retain younger employees. I'm excited to get into the nitty-gritty of this research that Kent's done and its implications for leaders on my fellow culture architects. And I'm sure today's conversation is going to be a great learning opportunity for everybody listening of all ages. So, Kent, welcome to Culture Architects.
Thank you. It's my honor to be here with you.
Well, that's great. So let's just go back and just for our listeners, Kent, give a little bit of background. So I know you've got a degree in practical theology. That's just even an interesting title to me. And then later there, you went on to study sustainable education. So tell me more about so what is practical theology and how'd you get into that?
David, in this kind of groups my research and what I do now all together in one big pot. I was raised in a hardcore blue collar family. Practical means a lot to me. And I've also learned over the years that practical means a lot to leaders. Mm-hmm. And just to, the practical theology piece was related to me getting in touch with something that I felt that was driving me, that was propelling me. And I wanted to understand this desire, this lack of a better word, fire inside of me from a practical perspective, more than just a theoretical perspective. When I went back and got my PhD focused on sustainability education, I was also focused on, I had a research emphasis on studying cultures that were struggling through a socioeconomic crisis related to migration, especially employee migration, workforce migration. And I was searching for a practical solution to it because I heard a lot of leaders in developing nations theorize, hypothesize why their top tier workforce continued to migrate out of their country or their culture. And I was searching for them to provide them with practical pathways and practical answers to solve this issue that consistently debilitated the culture over and over and kept them suppressed and keep them from reaching the place that they needed to be as far as growth and success.
Interesting. And so is that what led you to, I know you moved to Jamaica back in the 90s. Is that what led you to go to Jamaica?
I did. I led a school in Jamaica. It was a vocational school. Again, very practical, hands-on. We taught woodworking, horticulture, culinary arts, auto mechanics. I mean, we taught the basics. And when our young students would graduate after a 3-year process, it was, I learned the art of a deal, lack of a better way to say it, when they graduated, because employers knew they were going to be equipped with a skill set that would not only help the employer, but that they knew that the employee would be successful. So yes, that's what got me back there was the desire to participate in an environment that I knew was struggling to become and accept the identity that I knew that they had.
So you helped to educate these young people in rural Jamaica. Did it end up to be the case that more of them stayed there, or were they still migrating? And what did you learn about that? And how did that get into your research?
I made every one of them sign a contract when they graduated.
All right.
I couldn't enforce it.
We coerced them to stay.
Yes, that they would stay. I will say that because I do keep in just almost uber contact with most of the graduates, and when they graduate, after they graduated the school, that about a third of them did migrate. And the reason they migrated is the same reason that I discovered not only in Jamaica, but in all developing nations that I studied, that the majority of developing nations have an interesting form of suppression. They do not advocate for entrepreneurship. In other words, they keep entrepreneurship suppressed. Now, whether that is because the governmental leaders are threatened by especially young, aggressive minds that want to advance and create something that would not only, elevate their lives, but elevate their culture. I'm not sure about that. But what I do know is this, is that most of those developing nations have governments that suppress entrepreneurship. Some of those young entrepreneurs, they just could not be content in an environment where they could not follow that pathway that they felt called or led to be an entrepreneur. The overwhelming majority of the third that I have tracked that have come to this country, Canada or England, are entrepreneurs. And tragically, I will say, or unfortunately, those entrepreneurs are benefiting this country, Canada and England, and not the nations that they are from. And which I think is not necessarily a good look on developing nations, nor does it benefit or help them rise above that socioeconomic crisis they've been steeped in for years.
Yeah. I remember reading this goes back to like when I was in college, I think. I remember reading a book or something about research about revolutions and how revolutions are more likely to happen when people have a glimpse of what a new world could be versus when they don't. In other words, if they have no idea that life could be different than this, then things stay the same forever. It's when a certain class begins to have some picture of there is something other than what we've gotten used to that things start to change. And so I'm thinking about that as it relates to your description of whether governments in developing nations are purposely squashing that or it's just culturally built into them. Who knows? But bottom line is what I'm hearing you say is that when young people begin to get education and have an idea that they could create their own things, well, if I can't do it in my country, I'll go somewhere else where I can do it. And they leave. Which I suspect, it's interesting as I think about that, it seems like so many people that I've spoken to in the U.S. who are from other countries come here for opportunity because they see that there's this amazing opportunity that I could do whatever I want. And in my former country, wherever that happened to have been, I didn't have that opportunity. And so they come where the opportunities are. So how did that lead to, I know that, one of the things that for our audience that's most interesting about Kent is that where so many people read the research literature about what people have said, Kent has done his own primary research on thousands and thousands of young people around the world and what's important to them and what drives them, et cetera. So how did the research project get started? Where did that come from, Kent?
David, after living in developing nations in the Caribbean for 22 years, and I developed a research project that was focused on a crossroads. And that crossroads was, what is the relationship between socioeconomic crisis and entrepreneurship in developing nations? I spent 4 years researching that and speaking to leaders, people, especially all over the Caribbean, because that was my case study of 45 million people. And once I developed that, the door opened for me to be able to speak to a lot of leaders, not just in the Caribbean, but around the world in developing nations. And I began to present to them the pathway out of socioeconomic crisis and how critical entrepreneurship was. And I would speak to parliaments and again, on and on and on. And I was just extraordinarily blessed to have these just incredible doors open for me. However, now keep in mind, this was 10 years ago. I would have one consistent question when I was done that I could not answer that was maybe just fairly related to what I was talking about, but was a distant relationship. And that consistent question was, and I'm just going to word it, I'm going to quote most of the leaders. They would say, can you please tell me what's up with those damn millennials? And so, I would step back and I would say, I have 3 millennial children at home. I should be able to answer that. And I was walking through the Atlanta airport one day and I saw a book written on millennials by a well-known author. I picked it up, read it, noticed that it was endorsed by the who's who of organizational leaders. When I got done, I was very disturbed. And the reason I was disturbed was because I recognized that this book had been written from a sample size of 4 people and 2 of them were his children. But yet these organizational leaders had taken the information in this book and embedded it into their growth strategy And I was concerned about what would the outcomes look like if they were taking a sample size of 4 people and embedded into their growth strategy. And so I went onto Amazon and I found 31 books at the time. Remember, I was just focused on millennials, but I found 31 books focused on millennials. I ordered all 31, perused through all 31, and discovered that I could put all of them in one of 2 categories, either a small sample size or written by a crusty old baby boomer, which I am, by the way, but a crusty old baby boomer to throw the young generation under the bus for monetary reasons. So I asked myself a very simple question. What are leaders using to make critical decisions to their structure, to their culture, to their entire workforce, to their client base? What are leaders using to help them through this generational transition? So I developed a research project. It has 30 questions. It has 30 questions to baby boomers and Gen X, and it contrasts the same 30 questions to now Zillennials, Millennials, and Gen Z, which are the largest, as you already alluded to, block of the workforce. I'm able to take those delineations or those differences or those similarities between those answers and develop a pathway that will help leaders with informed, tested, practical solutions to navigate the transition, especially with the younger workforce that we're dealing with today. Now, one more side piece about that. I had no idea. I really had hoped that I could get 500 participants in the research project. That was my goal, 500 participants. Right now, today, there's a little bit over 53,000 participants from 33 nations. And it tells me something. The volume tells me something. It tells me that people are longing, looking, searching for solutions and answers to help them navigate this struggle that many seasoned leaders are having, attracting, engaging, and retaining, even keeping this younger workforce focused and accountable. There's a high degree of hunger and thirst for it, and it still exists to this day. It actually, in the last 2 years, I've seen that volume exponentially increase in a rate that I have not seen before, which tells me that thirst and hunger for leading and keeping the younger workforce accountable continues to grow and continues to be a concern among a lot of leaders.
So just for my sake and for our audience sake, let's just define some parameters here so we're all talking the same language. So define for me first the different generations, like what is Generation Z, X, Millennials, all these, where are the boundaries around which those generations are? And then my second question, in case you want to combine these two, is roughly in today's workforce, what percentage of the workforce is this generation versus that generation versus another generation, just so we have some sense of what we're talking about?
I'll refer to Zillennials quite a bit in this conversation. Zillennials would be from Millennials, Gen Z. If you look at the U.S. Census Bureau, that's what I use to determine or delineate these particular generations, because there's a lot of polling agencies that have kind of twisted some of the dates for monetary reasons and other reasons. A millennial, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, was born between 1982 and 2000. A Gen Z is 2001 to 2013. So the largest block of the workforce today, roughly about 56% of the workforce is Zillennial, which means they were born between 1982 and 2013. 1981 forward, Gen X. 1964 are backwards. 1964 and back, baby boomers. So I'm 1963. I'm right on the cusp of a baby boomer. But as we know, I mean, just logically, baby boomers are phasing out of the workforce. The largest block of the workforce is continuing to bloom, which is Zillennial.
Got it. And so that takes up to 2013. So yeah, that would be everybody that's in the workforce now. So do you, as you look at the research that you've done on these generations, I'm curious first, you mentioned 53,000 people in 30 some countries. Are there any major differences in how Zillennials, we'll call them, look at things in some countries versus others, or is there a fair amount of consistency that if you're in this age group, no matter where you live or where you're from, you basically look at the world similarly?
Wow, David. You just spoke really into the deep, deep little closet of my passion right there that I don't get to
Okay,
talk
good.
about a whole lot. I get to talk about in just geeky academic environments, but I think it matters. I think
Yeah.
what I'm about to say in your question matters a lot. Up until this point, and I don't want to pat my back too
Mhm.
much, and I don't want to inflate the significance of the research too much. But up until this point,
Mhm.
sociologists have always come to the conclusion that the environment in which we were raised has the highest level of determinants of who we are, our
Okay.
characteristics, the way we process things, the way we see things, the way we value things. Our environment is the most significant influence that we have over who we are as human beings. However, if I take the 500 participants from Sri Lanka and I take 500 participants from Philadelphia, your city,
Mhm.
or New York City, your city, which I've done many times,
Mhm.
there's an interesting dynamic that comes from there. And the dynamic is that we're seeing very, especially amongst Zillennials, let me qualify that. We're seeing similar behavioral patterns. We're seeing very similar priorities. We're seeing very similar um, outcomes in their lives, in the way that they treat money, family, environment, work. There's a whole list of things. And so then we go, well, how could we have made the shift from our local environment
Mm.
being or having the highest level of priority of the development of who we are as a human being? And now we're seeing 500 people in Sri Lanka that are processing things almost identically as 500 people in Philadelphia are. And it comes down to one simple factor, one simple variable: the advent of technology and the access to technology. And so now what's happened is
Mm.
we've redefined local environment into a technology environment, which now has
Mm.
taken the place of the most significant piece of our behavior, not only as,
Mm.
family, from sociological perspectives, on and on and on, which also, there's a danger there too. And I think that everybody would recognize the danger that's associated with it. But technology is the driving force of the development of the human race today across the globe.
So if I'm going to paraphrase what I'm hearing you say, and tell me if I have this right, that what we're essentially saying is because of technology, people all over the world are exposed to the same information roughly and are therefore being influenced in a similar way. Whereas pre all these technological changes, I would have been mostly influenced by my local market because I didn't know what was going on in Philadelphia. If I was in Sri Lanka, I don't know what's going on in Philadelphia. Today, I know what's going on everywhere around the world because we're all exposed to the same information. Is that essentially what you're saying?
Spot on. Spot on.
Yeah.
And it's just,
Fascinating.
it's access. It's
Mm-hmm.
just access. And because the world has access today, and again, there's a lot of positive to that, but I would say
Mm-hmm.
it is completely balanced out with the negative components there as well. And the negative components is that we have, especially in a lot of developing nations around the world, we see them losing their identity to
Mm.
technology because we see a younger workforce or a younger generation that is assimilating, maybe not from a geographical perspective, but from a mental perspective. They are assimilating into a culture in which they do not live. So they're processing it through those same
Mm.
things.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So let's shift then. So understanding that, let's talk about, it would seem to me then, and I imagine this, you find this in your research, you made the comment that a large percentage of the workforce today are Zillennials. And I'm guessing that a disproportionate percentage of the leaders are probably baby boomers. Um, and so we presumably have this disconnect between I'm a baby boomer leader and I think like a baby boomer, but most of my workforce thinks differently from me. What are some of the key differences that in how Zillennials look at the world from how previous generations, presumably baby boomers, look at the world?
I The only way I know how to delineate, the most effective way that I have learned to delineate that sounds like I'm being super hard on baby boomers and older Gen X. I'm not, because I've in full disclosure again, I am a baby boomer. Okay. It's this. I think it's the most simple way to look at it. Baby boomers and Gen X, especially baby boomers, see life through a ladder. I mean, how many times have we made this statement? You just have to climb the next rung on the ladder. You have to take a step to the next rung on the ladder. We see life as a ladder. It's a progression. It's climbing higher, climbing higher, climbing higher. The sacrifice, the commitment that's dedicated to going to the next rung on the ladder. And all of that is greatly appreciated. And all of that requires a lot of self-discipline. But we've climbed a ladder with a goal in mind. And that goal is that there's a pot of gold at the top, or, when we reach the top of that ladder, which technically, and by some definition is called retirement. However, all of a sudden, here comes millennials. And I'm not going to include Gen Z in this conversation, because millennials were right on. They had the front row seat to this.
Okay.
They saw the ladder. They witnessed millennials climbing the ladder. And again, they greatly appreciate the sacrifice and the commitment and the self-control and the discipline and all of those things that it took to climb the ladder. But at the same time, this generation had a front row seat to some of the greatest, if not the greatest, levels of dysfunction that we've ever seen in this country, with the highest divorce rates, the highest crime rates, the highest addiction rates. And in this generation, millennials took a step back and said, we appreciate commitment and self-control and discipline and all of those kind of things. But if accomplishment and success comes with all of those other things, I'm not so certain this is a pathway that we want to pursue. And so all of a sudden, we saw two ladder generations turn into a bridge generations. Hence, that's why I wrote the book, Bridges Over Ladders, is because now we see generations that aren't climbing ladders, they're building bridges. They also saw the ladders as reserved for me, myself, and I, for one person. Look, I'm not sure there's a lot of millennials that would come on a podcast and tell you that baby boomers were the most selfish generation. I'm not sure they feel that way, but ladders were reserved for one person. They build bridges because collectively they want to take people somewhere. Collectively, they want to take a community. Collectively, they want to take a nation or a state or whatever it may be. They see life through this collective perspective of building bridges to other peoples, other mindsets, other cultures, instead of setting a ladder up against a wall and climbing it. So I said a lot to say the difference is I see a ladder generation and I see a bridge building generation. And I'm not saying that one is greater than the other. I'm just saying that is the delineating factor that I see. One generation building bridges, another one climbing ladders.
Well, it's interesting. So a couple thoughts come to my mind as I hear what you're saying. So one, I think just from a purely practical standpoint, certainly my observation, most of us, is the younger generations are more comfortable with collaborative kinds of things, whether it's sharing a workspace, whether it's sharing a home or your car, or an Airbnb, where older generations, no, I want my place, I want my car, I want my home. I don't want to share my stuff with somebody else. Where younger generations seem to be totally comfortable with sharing of things, which adds, it's another element in what I hear you saying about this sort of collaborative type of generation versus a more personal generation. The other thing that occurs to me as I listen to what you're saying is that I wonder if, you're describing the reason we're guessing at. So why is this generation different? You're describing the reason, one of the primary reasons at least, as being they saw what being on the ladder got people and the negative stuff that went with it. And at some level said to themselves, I'm not sure it's worth it. I'm not sure that's what I want. I wonder if another part of that, though, is that some of the assumptions of that upward mobility are less assured today than they once were. And so let me give you an example of what I mean by that. I think about, let's just take a look at real estate. we grew up, so I'm roughly the same age as you, and we grew up when it comes to real estate with the assumption that we were always told you should buy a bigger house than you can afford because real estate always goes up, doesn't it? And that house will be worth more and more and more, and you'll always do better. And so you should always go that way. Then, the real estate crisis hit, and all of a sudden homes were worth less than they were before. And it's like, wait a second, that whole assumption is gone. It doesn't work anymore. And so I look at my kids and they don't have that same assumption that, real estate's always going to go up, or certain economic factors that caused the promise of always doing better. That was just such a built-in assumption for our generation. You're always going to do better than your parents, and each generation does better than their parents. And all of a sudden, I'm not sure that's true anymore. So I wonder if some of that perspective from the younger generations, while some of it may be, I don't know that I want some of what that previous generation had, I wonder if some of it's also, I'm not sure the assumptions that I always had about what that older generation would get are going to be true for me. So I don't even want to go for that because I'm not sure it works. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, you're spot on. If there's 2 points of, and I hate to characterize them this way in my research, of great concern, one of them is the high level of concern that I see about life, structure, growth coming from the younger generation and the older generations. However, their concern is completely different. You targeted, you were spot on about the level of concern from the younger generation. The older generation, there is no metric that's increased more in my research since January 2020 than this question. Are you concerned about the future of your company or organization with the younger workforce? In January 2020, that number was 48%. Today, that's 83%. So more than 8 of 10 people are concerned. Now, I'm about to say something that really gets into your lane. What we know is this, is that a leader that is leading from a position of concern is creating a culture of concern. A culture of concern propagates some things that are very difficult to overcome. A culture of concern breeds uncertainty. The leader is uncertain about the outcomes in their company or organization because they're concerned about the very foundation that holds them up, which is the largest workforce working their way up. Ultimately, my research and implementation show me that a concerned leader cultivates a culture of uncertainty, which almost always ends in conflict. So there's internal conflict creating an implosion inside of the company or organization. Now, when we look at that from the younger generation, you're right. Their level of concern is, it's also about outcomes. We're concerned about the outcomes. We're concerned that some of the factors that my parents or my grandparents used to make decisions about not only their work, but their lives and their country and on and on and on. Those factors no longer seem valid, and they're even threatened. And because they are, we're looking for and this gets to really the point that I want to make here, is that I've discovered that all of the generations in the workforce, and I would even argue all of the generations in our country and around the world, we're all longing for the same thing. And it's a clearly defined path of growth and success. And that's what the younger generation is longing for from especially the older generations in the workplace. Can you provide me a clearly defined path of growth and success? Because what I've observed is the path that you were walking on or navigating is no longer clearly defined. It's very cloudy right now. And I need that clearly defined path of growth and success.
Or said another way, it may also be, not only is it cloudy, but I'm not sure the path you're on works.
Yes, I would agree.
It may not even work at all.
I was being nice,
cloudy
Dave.
or clear. Well, and I guess, there's probably a couple pieces to that. One is, from the younger generation's perspective, I'm not sure that path that you were on, you being older generations, works, or I'm not sure the path you're on gets you the outcome, would get me the outcome that I'm interested in. So I may be interested in a different outcome than you were interested in previously, hence your ladders and bridges. Yeah. So that leads me to an interesting just sort of thought as I'm contemplating what you're saying, Kent. So we have this shift in the workforce where larger and larger percentage of the workforce are these zillennials, as we'll call them. At some point in the not too distant future, the baby boomers aren't going to be in the workforce, and they aren't even going to be the leaders. It's the zillennials who are going to be the leaders. How will the zillennials lead differently from previous generations when their leader is not just the workforce?
And what you just tapped into, I believe, ultimately can be the legacy of baby boomer and Gen X leaders. Mm-hmm. Will we provide, again, I'm going to go back to a clearly defined path of growth and success by listening to that younger workforce when we step out of the workforce? So my legacy will not be a ladder. My legacy probably won't be my accomplishment. My legacy will be that path that I lead for this younger generation to assimilate into leadership. What kind of clearly defined path will I leave for them? And at the same time, will I leave a path that is broad enough with boundaries, but will I leave a path broad enough for this younger generation to put their own stamp on what leadership means? For them to put their own sense of values and directions and build their own bridges that are there. Coming full circle, I see these younger generations as being much more collaborative than I did the older generations inside the workforce. I also see this younger generation, and I think this is there's two pieces to what I'm about to say. I see this younger generation being almost uber transparent inside of the workplace and inside their communities. That transparency leaves the older generations feeling very uncomfortable, i.e. a good example would be mental health and how easy and how fluid the younger generations are about talking about their mental health. Well, the truth of the fact is, even though I feel uncomfortable with it, that's on me. And all of a sudden, now here comes a generation or generations behind that are talking openly, transparently about mental health. And I cannot find fault in that. And so back to your question about what kind of leaders they will be, we see leaders, little older generations, that are focused on the structure in which they lead, the company in which they guide. Has merit, legit, not throwing shade on any of that. But now we see a leadership or a younger workforce that's assimilating into leadership that is driven by more than just the company or the organization or the structure that they lead. They're driven by the well-being of the employees that work for the company. How happy are they? What does their whole life look like? Not just their career look like. Are we helping them enough outside of the building? Because ultimately, when we help them outside of the building, we know they're more productive in the building, but we want a fluid culture inside of our building. So I see a level of transparency and vulnerability building, and this is what I was getting to, building a high level of trust. And I believe the younger generations are driven to develop and lead an organization that is steeped in trust, which is not just confined to career, the ladder, the pot of gold at the end. And I believe they've come to the conclusion that if we can cultivate an environment or a culture, lack of a better way to say, of trust when inside the company or organization, that the outcomes will actually be even greater than they were with the leaders who were driven by the ladder.
So I want to take a step back and think of this in maybe a more longitudinal kind of way. What you've said is that this shift in the way that younger generations look at the world is heavily influenced by technology, in the sense that we all have access to the same information. We're all influenced by largely the same things across the globe. So it's not a local, regional kind of thing. Do you think that, I mean, if you were to look over, instead of a 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 year period, we were to look over 100 or 150 year period and look at more macro trends, is this a wave that you think will change? Is this just a period of time in it, or is this something that's developing and will continue to grow in this direction? In other words, sometimes when you look at a trend in a short period of time, it looks different than if you were to look at it in a much larger period of time. Do you think, so how do you see that from that perspective?
I'll start by throwing something out that makes people very uncomfortable.
Sure.
And I may have said this to you, but I didn't start here, by the way, but I am here now. I'm convinced that when we look back 50 years from now, 100 years from now, that we will look at millennials as being one of the greatest generations in organizational history, not Gen Z, but millennials. And the reason for that is because they reconstituted some structures that were, by every definition, defined as absolute. They challenged them in ways that our structures have never been challenged before. And so what they've done is they've altered the paradigm, which ultimately alters the path of growth and success. And so I don't believe we can put that genie back in the bottle. I believe that the train track has been shifted to another train track, and now the train is running on that track and no more, to the track that we were on. And so, yes, I believe when we look back 100 years, we're going to look at this moment in time as saying there was a generation that altered the path of not only growth and success, but altered the way that we led, altered the way that we related, that moved away from a little bit of a selfish mindset into a collaborative mindset. I believe those are going to continue to play out. And the only other caveat or piece of information that I can bring into that is that in the research project, even though I'm speaking of Zillennials as one group, I do have them segmented in the research project, and even quadrant in this research project. And what I know from this, that all quadrants of Gen Z look at millennials with a very high level of respect, almost to the point where they realize that someone had to go out and do the dirty work for us to get to the place where now we can begin to live like that. And so I believe that's going to continue to grow. Now, will there ever be another shift? Obviously there will be. But this shift that we've just seen, I believe, is unprecedented. It's unprecedented from a financial perspective. It's unprecedented from an organizational perspective. And does technology have a piece to play there? Obviously it does.
Sure.
But it could not have happened. It could not have happened without a generation that said, we're going to choose to be at the tip of the spear. That's the only way I believe it could have happened.
Fascinating. I mean, shifting our conversation just a little degree to specifically how that affects culture. So we certainly hear everywhere, everybody knows that the younger generation going into the workforce is much more interested in talking about, so what's the culture of your company? What's that like? Where previous generations, I don't know that was even a conversation. I want to know, how much money do I make and what's the path to advancement? Here, people want to know, and when I say advancement there, I mean when do I get promoted? Were the kinds of things people were interested in before. Today, most younger people are asking potential employers, so what's the culture like there? So what should smart leaders know or be doing to attract we'll talk about attraction, then we'll talk about retention, but what should leaders be doing to create the kind of environment that is attractive to the younger workforce that's entering the workforce today?
Obviously, we're all creatures of repetitive habit. And it's one of the reasons I applaud you for the mission that you're on, because you are breaking a lot of those habits and you're deconstructing them and you're replacing them with very healthy habits. one of those deconstructive habits that especially older leaders have when they go into whether it be a college or university or trade school or even a high school to recruit. Many of them are still they're mired in the same behavioral pattern of this is what we can pay you, these are the benefits that we can give you, and we just go straight down that line instead of recruiting with this is the culture that we have, this is the clearly defined path of growth and success that we have, and these will potentially be the outcomes in your life. Instead of recruiting with those things, we're continuing to recruit with pay and benefits. I've got about probably, I just roughly say 20 plus leaders now that are going into institutions, again, of all levels of education, that are only recruiting with their culture, are only recruiting with the emerging leader structure that I developed. And when they are recruiting with those things, almost every time, I can't really put a metric to it, but almost every time they will call me and say, we just walked out with the top talent that was, on the table there. Because what you just said is so astute, is that the younger workforce sees the totality of their life, the wholeness of their life as being critical, to their career. And they do not see a delineation between the two. They just see life. They don't see career and life. And so when there's a great culture that's going to feed into my life and make my life better, not only in the building, but at home, in the community, in my house of worship, on and on and on. That's a culture. That's a pathway that I want to participate in and I want to grow and live in. And so attract top talent, culture, clearly defined path of growth and success. I can't say that any more emphatically.
Cool. And so let's talk about, so now I've got these people on board. What are the things from a retention standpoint, now that they're here? I'm sure they're similar, but what are the key things I should be focused on if I'm a leader of a company to retain these people who I've just brought in?
I want to go to the emerging leader structure that I developed, and because that's the solution that I've seen make the most difference in retention. The emerging leader structure has 4 central components that are all about retention, but we could even argue engagement and also attraction. Those 4 components are a clearly defined path of growth and success, where the first component is learn, teach foundational leadership lessons. And here's the key part, that are relevant to what's going on in the real world. I even argue a lot of times that the learning component of the emerging leader structure, a central component, is to unlearn what many of them have learned in colleges and universities. So for an example, and I may have said this to you before, David, and it got me in trouble, that when I was teaching at the university and I got to choose the classes that I would teach classes where all of the students were graduating with that semester. And I would tell them the first thing of every class, my role in your life over the next 16 weeks is to undo all the theoretical BS that you've learned in the last 3.5 years and serve as a bridge to help you understand what's really going to happen out there in the real world. We all know how many employers and leaders have said, I'm hiring a kid out of Villanova, or I hate to pick on Villanova, but anywhere, I'm hiring a kid out of any college or university, and I'm having to retrain them for 2 years before they get to the place of the level of productivity. So we have to have a structure that has a learning component of foundational leadership lessons. Then it has to have a component of growth, of whole life growth. We've already talked about that. I see that as in a small group, iron sharpens iron mentorship perspective. The third one is that the first one, learn. The second one, growth. The third one, test. And this one that makes people a little bit uncomfortable. I've noticed a couple of concerns with seasoned baby boomer leaders in the last 5 years. And one is they're growing more and more timid about holding the younger workforce accountable. And that is legit, because they know that the cost and the expense of replacing them if they leave. That's the first thing. The other concern that I see is that intensity and moments of intensity are what position us with a culture of confidence, of knowing I'm certain of the outcome of that employee or that group of employees or that team of employees, because they've already had to navigate some intense moments. They've been tested. And because they've been repetitively tested, I'm confident and secure in the outcome. But I've noticed, and this gets a little bit, again, uncomfortable for some leaders, but I've noticed that seasoned leaders have replaced intensity with sensitivity. And when we lead from a position of sensitivity and remove intensity from the environment, we're very uncertain about the outcomes, and we create an environment of uncertainty. So our emerging leader structure: learn, grow, which is whole life; test, which is moments of intensity, which they're intentional. And the last one is success, where we put people in a position where they take a concept and they turn it into revenue, not just from a theoretical perspective, but from a real life working perspective. We keep people on that track for 3 years. What we know is when they get on the track and they're learning, they're growing, and they're seeing success, they don't want to leave the company or organization because it's been clearly defined for them. They know where they're going. They recognize who is investing in them, and they see the potential outcomes that are in front of them. So hypothetically, if they begin to look to the right or the left, if they look to pasture, greener pasture somewhere, supposed greener pastures, they're looking over there and they do not see a clearly defined path of growth and success. They don't see a culture that is cultivating growth and success. They see a culture that is concerned. They're in a confident culture and they want to remain in that confident culture. So retention is contingent on that clearly defined path of growth and success.
Cool. So let's shift the conversation to a sort of, I'm going to call it a mundane issue. It feels mundane, but yet this is coming up everywhere. I know you hear it. I hear it everywhere. And it relates to this whole topic. And that is whether people, the whole return to work, whether we're working virtually or working in the office. And I hear so many leaders that feel like they're struggling with this dilemma of, on one level, giving my staff the ability to work anywhere they want, however they want, and being flexible feels like a really good thing. And it helps people have more of a whole life. And at the same time, I hear so many leaders feeling like, we definitely feel like we've lost productivity here, that people aren't learning from each other because they're not together. They're not building the same kinds of bonds they were if they were together. They're not overhearing the conversation that the guy next to me had that would have led to a good conversation about how to help clients or whatever else. And they're really struggling with, how do we find the right balance between the things we feel like we've lost because people aren't together, and yet wanting to be flexible enough to allow people to work however they want to work? Where do you come down on that based on your research and what you've learned?
The metrics in the research show us that 52% of baby boomers and Gen X, 52% say the place that has the highest level of productivity and efficiency for me to work from is in the building. So 52%, that leaves 48%.
I know, exactly. That's not a pretty, exactly. That's a tough place to be when it's half and half.
But 45% of Zillennials say the most productive and most efficient place for me to work is also in the building. And so I'm not seeing a great divide here. And I believe this divide has been propagated by, whether it be media outlets, whatever. But I know there's some
makes for a better story.
Yeah, it does. But I do know there's some legitimacy associated with it. But I continue to go back to a couple of key factors. The younger workforce thrives in a collaborative environment. I'm also seeing in the metrics where the most effective method or channel of communication with the younger workforce, in other words, they're communicating this. They're communicating in the research that the most effective and efficient way to communicate is face-to-face. And we're seeing that metric continue to grow. That can't happen if we're working from home.
Yep.
And I asked that question from 5 different perspectives so that I can get a full understanding of it. And the metric in all of those places is continuing to grow. And then I will say maybe the most important factor goes back to that mental health issue. And we also know, especially where we have small groups, whole life small groups functioning inside the building, inside the culture, where people are able to communicate and talk about some of the issues that they're having to navigate through life. We're also seeing not just incrementally, exponentially increase in healthy mental health rates inside the building. But that does not happen if they're remaining at home. And so the solution to that, it's always going to be a difficult piece. I really believe when this all settles out, if the job allows it, remember, not all jobs allow that.
Sure.
If the job or the career allows it, I do believe that it's going to settle out in some type of hybrid model. And I believe that hybrid model, we're going to see that play out with, especially as millennials assume the leadership positions. I believe that hybrid model is going to win the day. I don't believe that stay at home is going to win the day. And I'm not certain that be at work all the time is going to win the day. I really do believe that hybrid model is going to win.
It makes sense. I mean, there's so many benefits to each that you hate to give up all for one.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So this has been a fascinating conversation, Ken. As we kind of wrap up our conversation, one of the things I'm always interested for anybody in any role is I'm always curious about, I always like to ask people about kind of the lessons learned in life, the wisdom they've gained over time. And so I guess the way I would position that with you is, before you started, if you can even remember, before you started doing this research, I imagine you had some hypotheses about, whether stated or unstated, about what you thought the research would tell you. And I'm curious whether you've documented those or can remember them. What do you think today that's different from what you thought before you did the research? So you had some points of view about people, the world before that research, and now informed by that research, you say, man, was I wrong? I have a whole different view of that. What are the biggest differences?
I had to completely relocate to a different camp, David. and the relocation was this. I lived in the same camp of which many, many older people did. I was observing what I felt were entitled, lazy, selfish generation.
Okay.
And the research unpacked to me that we are leading a generation that's the most creative, collaborative, opportunistic generation that we've ever witnessed. And so smart, I can go on, and innovative. There's just so many characteristics there. It does not happen without a great culture that, facilitates that. I will say that. And so maybe the biggest lesson is that I don't have to be concerned, because I was in the concerns camp about what's coming down the pike, because I, like a lot of people, had bought into this mindset. I know this is a little bit extreme, that are all of these younger generations living in their parents' basement. And I've discovered that all of that is not, that it's just nonsense. Is there a degree of that? Yeah, but it's so minute. It's absurd. So I've had to move from the concern camp to, I'm in the confident camp right now about this generation. And I've already alluded to, I think that millennials will be the greatest generation in organizational history when we look back. And I'm confident about that. And look, I'll close that on a story an interview that I did just recently that really rocked me. The former prime minister of Israel, his name is Naftali Bennett. Naftali Bennett said that prior to October the 7th, he also saw the younger generations, as entitled, lazy. He even used the word soft. They're soft. They're educatedly soft. But on October the 7th, he saw something. He saw that what he defined as a soft generation not run from the fight, but run to the fight. And they ran to the fight for the greater good. He saw a level of courage that he had never seen before, while his own generation were lined up at the airport, couldn't wait to get on the airplane to get out of the country. And so he said, the conclusion that I came to after witnessing the courage from the younger generation was that we have a nation of lions. But if we sit around and we judge as soft, but we don't have environments that will test, grow, produce, we don't really realize that we have a nation of lions. I'm convinced of this. Every organization that I go into, I see an employee base of lions, of hungry lions who are waiting to grow. And so no longer am I concerned. I'm confident. That was a lot to answer that one question, but I'm confident about what's ahead. I'm not concerned about what's ahead with this younger generation leading not only our organizations, but our nation and the world. I'm confident in good outcomes,
awesome.
Healthy outcomes.
That's awesome. So, Ken, this has been a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate you joining me. Tell for our audience, if they want to learn more about your research, about the work you do. I know that you work with lots of employers, helping them to develop strategies for attracting and retaining this younger generation. Where would people find out more about your work?
They can at retentionpartners.com.
Okay.
First, Dr. Kent Wessinger at gmail.com. Reach out to me. I'm all over YouTube, all over LinkedIn. I would probably say the healthiest place, the most effective place is just go to my LinkedIn profile, Dr. Kent Wessinger, send me a message. We can make something happen from there. And as I have continued to push forward in helping leaders not only solve, maybe the most important point is position that younger workforce for sustainable growth and help them develop a clearly defined path of growth and success. I would say that my mission has boiled down to one thing, is creating growth for young leaders. And that's my mission inside every company and organization, that emerging leader structure that has those components that will produce growth among young leaders that ultimately benefits the company and the older leaders themselves.
That's great. Well, thank you again, Kent. Appreciate you joining us on Culture Architects.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.